Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome back my friend Meredith Angwin for the third time on the Power Hungry Podcast. Meredith, thanks for coming again on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me three times. I'm just delighted.
Well, I'm delighted as well, and I'm going to make full disclosure right here at the top. The reason I asked you back, and I talked about it with my colleague Tyson Culver, who's the producer for the podcast. The podcast that we did in February, in fact, it was February 17th, is the most popular podcast that we've done on the last year. And today marks the 1 year anniversary, or this episode marks the 1 year anniversary of the very first Power Hungry podcast. We've done 57 episodes. And you rank number one on all of those 57 episodes. So your public loves you. And so
Thank you.
I'm going to feed the public. You give them what they want, and you were the most popular guest we had. So of course I wanted to have you on again. So let's jump right in. And as you know, and I've just wrote a piece, I published a piece in Real Clear Energy about what's going on in the Texas grid on Monday, I guess it was the 14th. The ERCOT issued a plea to reduce electricity demand because once again, the state is facing electricity shortages. What's interesting to me is that comes exactly 4 months to the day since ERCOT last issued a plea for conservation, which was the beginning of the winter storm. Now we're in hot weather. We're getting the same messaging. What the hell is going on, Meredith Angwin? Why is this happening?
Well, ERCOT is a RTO, Regional Transmission Organization area, and it runs with a very slender margin of backup for when things are bad, and that kind of slender margin falls apart very quickly in the winter, because in the winter you have often less availability of natural gas at natural gas plants because it's being diverted to home use, or the compressors aren't doing well on the pipelines or whatever, and you have more demand. Now in the summer, you have more demand, but you should have as much natural gas as you want because it's usually not being diverted, and pipelines are usually a lot better about running in hot weather than with valves freezing or frozen water appearing within the pipeline itself in cold weather. So it seems like it shouldn't have a problem, but ERCOT has always run with a very, very low margin. That is where other grids try to keep maybe 15, 20% more power plants available than they will need for peak. ERCOT tends to run at like 8%.
And then in the single digits, yeah.
Single digits. And the other thing about that 8% is you got to get really deep into the weeds to see how real that 8% is, because if you begin looking at it without getting too deep into the weeds, you'll say, oh, well, 8% should be okay. But what percentage of that 8% is wind, for example, or solar? And in general, at least on our grid, wind, and I'm in New England. For those of you who don't know, I'm speaking to you from Vermont. At least in our grid, wind doesn't bid in to the capacity markets or get counted in terms of megawatts available at full nameplate. It's discounted from that.
Right.
But I don't know how ERCOT does it. I mean, this is the problem with, I wrote a book about the grid, and I think it's a good book, and it has a lot of insight. A lot of people have said to me, oh, I began to understand my grid after reading your book. But to really understand your own grid, you're going to have to learn about the specifics of how your grid runs. So I can't tell you right now, because I'm here in New England and I haven't studied everything about the Texas grid, whether ERCOT counts 1 megawatt of wind at the same level of installed capacity, backup available, and so forth, as 1 megawatt of a gas turbine. I don't know.
Well, and I can answer that. I mean, they do discount the capacity of wind, and I think they count and in a single digit percentage of the available capacity as being ready or deployable during times of peak demand. But let me just jump back, I want to come back to ERCOT because I published, in fact, I did a power brief I published on YouTube, just a 3-minute explainer video about what's going on with wind during the hot weather. I also have a piece in Real Clear Energy showing that when power demand in Texas spikes in the summer, wind effectively disappears. It just vanishes. It goes to, as I said, it goes with Ted Cruz to vacation in Cancun.
Yeah.
But tell me about shorting. Now, this is the third time you've been on the show and on the podcast. How was it, you published the book in October of 2020, and I know from talking to you before, I think our first interview was in November of 2020. We talked about what happened in California. How's publishing the book changed your life? I mean, because it's changed your profile dramatically, has it not?
Oh yeah, it has totally changed. I mean, there were always a lot of people in the energy sphere, especially people who were pro-nuclear, who knew about me. And then there was a bunch of people locally, because I was a member of the consumer liaison group for our grid operator, that knew about me. But if you went away from locally, grid people didn't know about me. I mean, it was just sort of, and now I get all kinds of emails and invitations to speak and so forth, because invitations to podcasts because of the book. And I think it's really wonderful. And the reason it's wonderful isn't because I'm becoming rich, but because, and I'm not. As you know, writing books is no way to a palatial a lifestyle, but because the book is getting out there, people are reading it, people are writing and saying, hey, I didn't understand what they were talking about. It was all acronyms. It was all this junk coming by, mopers, and now I know what it is. And I feel so good about that, because you see, when utilities, okay, let me start by saying my book is mostly about how regional transmission organizations, which are the kind of grid governance where there are auctions all the time. You have kilowatts are at auction, and then distribution utilities buy them, and generators put them up for sale, and so forth and so on. There's all these auctions and layers of auctions. Anyway, RTOs, regional transmission organizations, are that sort of place.
Clearinghouse, really, I guess, is one of the ways to describe them, right? Or
what?
Yeah.
What did you say?
A clearinghouse.
They're a clearinghouse, yes, a clearinghouse with elaborate rules in general.
Yeah, very elaborate. Yes.
Rules get very elaborate, but the thing is that a lot of people, before I wrote the book, and probably still, don't even know they're in an RTO area, because what they see is their own utility. Okay, so when they hear that the grid operator has said there may be shortages over the summer, they think somehow their utility is the problem, or they don't. Or for example, I asked a friend of mine who lives in Chicago. I said, well, how is it living in a little bit of PJM RTO in the middle of MISO RTO? I've often wondered about that. And she's like, what? I mean, she doesn't think of herself as living in a PJM RTO in the middle of MISO RTO, because, it just doesn't. Have you ever heard of PJM is now holding a meeting where we want the public to write in and tell us what we should be doing about this particular thing that's up for a vote or something? No, they keep a low profile.
It's all invisible to the consumer, or just not on their radar. But I want to go back to that, because I think it's interesting and before we started recording, you mentioned your birthday was on May 21st, and you turned 76. And one of the reasons why
I don't usually publicize that much.
But I bring it up because to me it increases my respect for you and what you've done. Right, this is what, your fourth career at your age, where you have every reason to be putting your feet up on the porch, and you have grandchildren, and you have other things you could be doing. But you've said it's changed your profile, changed your life. You're not getting rich, but it must feel good to at this point in your life to be getting some recognition or an opportunity to discuss these issues, which you obviously are so passionate about. You wrote a book that's nearly 400 pages. I mean,
more than 400 pages, but that's counting the glossary and the index.
Yes, so no, right. I'm looking. I just picked up 422 if you count every page that's numbered, and then there's some other. But what is that? Is the payoff worth it? I mean, and I don't mean that to be sly or anything, but you put a tremendous amount of effort. And you got it out there, and now you're getting some recognition to talk about these issues that you care about. How does that feel?
Well, it feels very nice because I feel I'm letting people know about something that was hidden from them and that would affect their lives. I mean, let's face it, I wrote that book because I think the RTO areas are heading to being very fragile grids. And what do I mean by fragile? I mean, it takes less and less to get rolling blackouts. I mean, any grid can get broken with a big enough incident. But the question is, how robust is it? How resilient is it? What does it take to actually end up with rolling blackouts? And in the RTO areas, the answer is not much and less as time goes on. And the reason is that they by their governance, they move toward being dependent on renewables plus natural gas plus, if all else fails, we'll ask the neighbors.
Right.
And
which is the fatal trifecta, which I think
right.
of all if I could boil your work down to one phrase, that's it. Because what you've done is really boiled down this fragilization of the grid, which you've talked about with Chris Kiefer, Dr. Chris Kiefer, who has the Decouple podcast. But isn't that the punchline of all of the work you're doing? You're calling out to the world. You're saying, look, our grid is becoming more fragile. And I've looked at the data from the DOE's Office of Cybersecurity. The number of grid emergencies and unplanned outages has tripled just in the last 5 years. I mean, these are worrying trends in terms of outages, blackouts, and what we're seeing here in Texas. These issuances of notices that we're having shortages are more common. We had devastating blackouts in February. California is already saying NERC, the North American Electricity Reliability Council, has already warned about shortages this summer. I mean, you're talking about the most important network in society, and are you getting? Are people really paying enough attention? Because it seems like these issues should be on the front page of the paper nearly all the time, and they're not.
Well, that's true. They're not. They're only on the front page when there's a blackout. Now, one of the problems is that to some extent, people are used to little blackouts on the distribution system. You know, tree goes down, whatever. And so people tend to think, oh, well, the power will be back on. But we're having a new kind of blackout with these rolling blackouts. We're having blackouts due to not having enough power available, having the wrong kind of power available. What I mean by that is power that you can't count on, natural gas and renewables. Well, natural gas during the summer you can count on it, but during the winter not. And so we're having a different kind of blackout, which is adding to the old kind. And I don't think it's really penetrated to most people that the new blackouts are just a bigger deal. I mean, they're not about getting some linemen out there to fix it. They're systemic. They're built into it. We don't have the power plants to do this. We don't have the firm fuel supply to keep the lights on, and that is a very different thing from, oh my goodness, an oak tree went down and it went down in a really bad place, and it's going to take us a day and a half to get this thing open again.
And that was relatively simple. You send out a few guys in bucket trucks and chainsaws, and you can get that line back up and operating in a few hours. But when you're saying that, Meredith, one of the points that you made on an earlier episode, you talked about the importance of on-site fuel. And when I look at the ERCOT grid, and from I think 2005 to 2020, the amount of generation from wind energy increased by about 20%, and the amount of electricity produced from coal-fired power plants declined about the same amount.
Right.
So in hearing you say that, I'm thinking, well, How much of this is due to the reduction in coal-fired capacity, which when coal plants have been the major source of electricity generation in America since the days of Edison, and yet there's been, frankly, a war on coal, or that environmental groups saying we need to back coal out, and that reliance on a very reliable form of fuel, carbon intensive, but nobody wants to say anything positive about coal. But when you were saying those things, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. How much is the retirement of coal plants played into this?
Well, it has. The retirement of coal plants has played into this, and and I mean, I guess what I'm concerned with more is the retirement of nuclear plants, because if someone is in very concerned with carbon and carbon dioxide and so forth, they can say, well, every coal plant that retires is a win. But a nuclear plant isn't a win that way. It wasn't making any carbon dioxide. And so I guess the thing is that another thing is that it's a matter of values to some extent. For example, do you value having reliable electricity? I think it is so essential. You have written a whole book about it. You've done a film about it. We don't want to get to the point where we're some kind of Beirut South or Beirut West, where everybody has their own generator. It's more than just Beirut. I mean, when my husband was doing a project for a while in India, I mean, the company had their generators because the power went out so frequently, and that's common in many areas of the world. We don't want it to be common here. I mean, that is a really bad way to run a grid, to say, well, if you're a business, just keep your generator around. Of course, we have them for hospitals, because if a hospital loses power, this is a really dangerous thing for the people in the hospital. But businesses, I mean, it's not dangerous for them except for their ability to do business. But pretty soon you get a grid that's fragile enough, and the businesses have to have their generators, and pretty soon the houses have to have their generators. I mean, I just feel that people are saying, "Oh, let's shut down the plants that have that are very reliable, because we don't really care that much about reliability compared to carbon." And I think that is not the right way to look at the electric grid. We should care about reliability and try to be low carbon.
Well, let me come back to the nuclear question for a minute, because you live in Vermont. Remind me of the town that you live in.
I live in Wilder, but it's the town that had Vermont Yankee is Vernon. It's about 50 miles south of me.
Sure. So let's come back to the nuclear plants, because you were I've done a lot this year, and this is, again, reminder, this is the 1-year anniversary episode of the start of the Power Hungry podcast. My guest is Meredith Angwin, who, of all 57 episodes that we've done, she was the most popular, so she is back again. She's the belle of the ball. But when you talk that discussion you had about reliability, Meredith, it reminds me of did a presentation last December to some electric cooperatives in Oklahoma. And the manager of the Oklahoma Electric Cooperative Association, a guy named Chris Myers, made a point that when he said it, I thought, well, duh. And, why didn't I think of that? But he said, without reliability, your affordability goes out the window. And that's the point that you're making here. And it's a point that I think is critical in the wake of the blackouts here in Texas. I was blacked out for 45 hours. I'm constantly being hit with advertisements for standby generators, batteries, and solar panels. So the way I would read back to you what you just said about these need for standby generators is that because people are more concerned about reliability, the affordability is going down because they're having to deploy a lot of capital. They're spending a lot of money on generators and other things that they would never have thought of buying before. But now they're so concerned about losing power that they're willing to, frankly, it's a misallocation of capital. If we had a reliable grid, they wouldn't be doing that. And that, to me, is really an important issue, because that affordability issue, who's going to be able to buy the standby generators? Well, It's people that are doing okay. Maybe, people like me, but wealthy people, they're going to buy their own generators, their own battery packs, et cetera. So it's not just about reliability, affordability. It ultimately becomes a class issue, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And one of the things that bothers me a great deal, and is that when when people talk about, we don't really need reliability that much or whatever, they're assuming they can handle it because maybe they'll have their own generator, maybe they'll have their little area will have a little microgrid, whatever, or they'll sit around and sing camp songs by a fireplace. I mean,
there's a blackout, so we're going to have a marshmallow roast or something.
Yeah, no, really. I mean, people don't understand how much of their lives are dependent on that electric grid. I mean, well, people learn to understand it, but it may be too late. But no, it is a class issue, because when you look at the people who passed away in Texas due to the grid, it wasn't rich people. It was people trying to heat their homes with a little bitty heater that put out noxious fumes. It was people who were in a poorly insulated house and found themselves getting basically freezing to death. It's sort of like people don't realize it, like crowded living conditions, for example, can lead to, are correlated with asthma. I mean, they are correlated with asthma. And so, if you're going to look at how could you have a healthy population, reasonable size houses, clean energy for those houses, that is what you really need. And when people begin talking about environmental justice, I often don't know what they're talking about, because they seem to think that means a solar panel on every roof, but not everybody has a roof. I mean, people live in crowded conditions. If you live in, I grew up, in Chicago. The first place we were living, it was a typical 3-story apartment building in Chicago. Where were we supposed to have our solar panel? I don't think we were going to have one.
Well, it's interesting you talk about that affordability issue and the issue that it wasn't rich people who died during the freeze. In fact, there was last month, BuzzFeed News did an analysis, and it was similar to what I think it was ProPublica or another group did after the Puerto Rico hurricane. But the punchline was the same. Remember, after the Winter Storm Uri here in Texas, the initial official government estimates were about 100 to 150 people died. The Houston Chronicle in April did another analysis, said that was actually closer to 200. BuzzFeed did an analysis and concluded that the excess mortality, when you included all the people who are medically fragile and vulnerable before the blackout, that the total death toll was closer to 700. And what was interesting about the Houston Chronicle analysis was, to your point, many of the people who died in that, when counted in that 200, died of carbon monoxide poisoning. And, you can say, oh, well, they should have known. You put your electric generator outside and so on. But those deaths from carbon monoxide poisoning are very common in America. Dozens of people die every year, and they're deaths of energy poverty. And that's the part that I think, again, goes to this issue of class, in that if they had available energy that was clean, that was reliable, they wouldn't need that standby generator. They wouldn't be dead.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with it. And, when, sometimes there was somebody out here, some environmentalists supposedly said, well, so many people about reliability, but we want clean power much more than we want reliable power. And I thought, well, you want clean power more than reliable power, you say, until such time as you don't have any power, then I'm willing to bet you'll take whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So let me just, if you don't mind a minute, I want to come back to the nuclear thing, but just a minute. But I want to go back to the one of the key reasons why I wanted to have you on again. And Tyson Culver, my colleague, and I talked about this at length, but that you've achieved this a rare feat, right? And I say this with a great deal of respect, that you don't have a fancy university behind you. There's no big think tank or something else, but you through your own gumption and hard work at age 76, you've now becoming a recognized authority on what should be considered one of the most important issues in American energy policy. And that leads me to my question. That was one of the reasons why, I mean, you're such an atypical expert, right? That you're not going to, and I say that again with a great deal of respect, but it's earned. It's earned over many decades of experience and decades of learning. And here's the question. So since shorting has been published, are you more hopeful about the need for understanding the importance of RTOs and why they're not working, or less hopeful? Have things gotten better since you published the book, or worse?
I think they've gotten better. I think there are more people now who are saying, for example, a tweet would happen when someone says, these areas are expecting possible rolling blackouts over the summer. And then someone else tweets and says, well, look at that. That's pretty much a map of the RTO areas. People didn't say that a while back. Now, I'm not saying that Twitter is the whole thing, but at this point, I think there's more awareness that the RTOs aren't working, not just on Twitter, but just like a newspaper article might mention our local grid operator said blah, 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 in a way that they didn't write it quite that way before. Before, it was like our local grid operator, they're the word of the Lord, as opposed to the grid operator says this, but there are some issues about fuel availability, which seem not to be, I don't know. I just feel there is more interest in exactly what's going on out there.
And that has to feel good for you in terms of these issues, and that that your book is being recognized as an authoritative book on what to do next. But as I've thought about this, and you make this point, you made the point about the RTOs. What's the cure? Because I see is it going to require Congress to say, well, we need a more cohesive strategy? Because there's a lot of regionalism here, and particularly in Texas, about, oh no, we're going to have our own, our own grid operator and so on. What's the ultimate cure here? Is it going to require federal action then to really get focused on this reliability issue?
Well, actually, I would say that the cure is more regional. I mean, the thing is that in the old days, when they weren't RTOs, states were responsible for their own integrated resource planning, which meant they had to show, the PUC had a rule that the various utilities plans for operating power plants, for transmission, local transmission lines, and fuel availability were just and reasonable and worth being compensated for. And the PUC held the purse strings. We'll compensate you or we won't. So the utilities took dealing with the PUC very seriously. They don't take it as seriously with the RTO, because the RTO runs these auctions, and then the auctions, they change the rules for the auction because it didn't look right. It didn't get the results they wanted.
But at the same time, you've seen what's happened is that the many of the utilities have been deregulated, so they've been broken up. So I mean, it was one of the things that I wrote down. It seems to me fundamentally, and you make this point in the last chapter in Shorting the Grid, that this deregulation of the utilities has not been good for the consumer or for reliability. So
No,
if what you're saying is that the states have to take this on, are you saying then that we need to go back to the regulated utility model and have the state PUCs being, having continuous and proper oversight over those regulated utilities?
Well, I think so, but I mean, I
It's
think
an unpopular notion, especially with the Googles and the independent power producers and the Amazons and the huge companies that are promoting renewables. That's not what they want.
well, if you follow the money, why are the huge companies promoting renewables? Are they just so pure in heart and the rest of us are awful? No, I mean they figured. Let's put it this way: I had an interview with somebody. It was just it wasn't online, but at one point I said, it's not a power plant can't make money. A reliable power plant can't make money under the RTO system. As a matter of fact, there's a whole literature about this called the search for the missing money, because the way they have to bid in is not good. And so he says, "Oh, you say nobody can make money." I said, "I didn't say nobody. Renewables can make money in the RTO system because they get most of their money outside the markets that the RTOs are running. They get it from tax breaks, production tax credits, making a REC, renewable energy credit or certificate, which they can sell to another power plant, another utility that needs to prove that it has it's using renewables, and it can't build the renewables. It doesn't want to build the renewables, but what it does is buy a REC. So here's this renewable. It's selling its power to one utility, distribution utility, and selling its REC for that power to another distribution utility. It's making money. So I think the thing that is perturbing about it is when the less reliable power suppliers are the only ones that you can really say, yeah, they're gonna be doing all right despite this system. Well, of course, everybody wants to be them. I mean, I would want to be them too. If I was deciding I'm taking up running power plants, I'd look around and say, so which ones are doing good? And I'd say, oh, okay, if I'm in an RTO area, especially, the renewables are doing good. If I build renewables, everybody will love me because I'm so noble, and I'll get payment for RECs, and I'll get payment for production tax credit. And if the prices on the grid go up, I'll get that money too. And meanwhile, the reliable power plants are on their search for the missing money.
This, and I think this is the key point that, and you hit the nail, in my view, right on the head. And it's the piece that I wrote for Real Clear Energy, talking about this very thing, that what's going on in Texas, where we're seeing spikes in power demand. And during those periods where power demand is spiking, wind energy has nearly disappeared. On Tuesday, which was what, the 15th, the power demand peaked at 70,000 megawatts, and wind energy production in the state, there are 32,000 megawatts of wind energy capacity in Texas. Their output was effectively zero. 0 megawatts when power demand was spiking to 70,000 megawatts. So, and yet what you're saying is that despite their unreliability, that's where the money is. And
Yeah,
that's the part that is truly staggering to me, is that when you look, and I published this as well, is that when you look at the RTO, the queue for interconnection in the ERCOT grid, it's 35 gigawatts. All of it is renewables. It's about 25 megawatts of 24 megawatts of 24,000 megawatts of solar, and 11 megawatts of more wind that won't perform. The wind won't perform in the summer, and we know the solar won't perform in the winter. So we're adding yet more renewables to the fatal trifecta in Texas is what I see. Am I missing something?
Yes, and that is what's happening, and the reason is that there's no reward for reliability, and that is anywhere in an RTO system. So, for example, I was on an American Nuclear Society panel, and of course, people were talking. Well, people often talk about how Texas is just weird. And I'm like, no, Texas is an RTO. That's all you have to say about it. I mean, it's not just weird. And they say, well, you don't, it didn't winterize. And I said, okay, look, we have very cold weather here, and we winterize for a certain level of it. The way to winterize a gas turbine for cold weather is to admit that it's probably not going to be able to get to gas, and it's going to have to store a fuel on site, generally oil, though it could be propane. Okay, but basically it's a fuel that can be stored easily on site, as opposed to natural gas, which is delivered through pipelines. And so the thing is, who you would say in that case during the winter, most of the natural gas plants should have their little stores on site for maybe to run for 12 to 24 hours if they can't get gas. Well, they don't. And the thing is that I show this chart, and it's I don't know if it's in my book or not. No, I didn't put it in my book, because the thing is the chart has a bar chart. And for every day during a really cold snap in New England, it has a bar, and the bar is green almost all to the top. And at the top, there's a little blue area, and the green is natural gas that was burned because the grid operator bought. I'm sorry, oil that was burned because the grid operator bought oil for that plant, because it knew that it would be a bad time in a cold snap. Those are winter reliable.
And that natural gas wasn't going to be available, or they couldn't get
natural
the gas, so
gas
they're burning fuel oil.
Not going to be available. So the grid operator had a winter reliability project to buy oil for natural gas plants, and that green line is the oil that the grid operator bought. The little blue line at the top, which is almost invisible, which is why I didn't put it in the book. Nobody would be able to see it. Once you printed it in black and white. That's what the power plants bought without the grid operator. So they weren't getting ready for winter. So if you say, oh, well, Texas, they didn't get ready for winter. Well, in New England, they didn't get ready for winter. I mean, they got ready in the sense that they were ready to run in cold weather, but they didn't do anything about getting fuel for cold weather. So they didn't really take into account reliability in winter, because it's not their problem.
Well, and that's one of the things that I think is more than any other. And by the way, so you're just saying that the blue line was where the gas was coming in, not gas. No.
I'm so sorry. I have to, I'm not expressing it well. I really shouldn't do this.
Well, I think your point,
the green part is oil purchased by the grid operator as winter reliability project, and it's the long line.
Gotcha.
The blue line is whatever the power plants actually bought without the grid operator. Okay. And it's skinny, and it would not have done the job, because the power plants didn't bother to, I mean, it didn't bother. It's very, it sounds like I'm calling them names. It wasn't in their economic interest to invest in a lot of oil.
I see.
Just in case they had to use it.
Right. Well, see, and that's one of the things that is I've looked at now 4 months after the disaster here in Texas that left hundreds dead, and many of them dying of the lack of energy. Dozens of people froze to death. Other people died later because of the medical conditions, and the toll may have been 700. But in all the legislative hearings, in all of the policymaking, all the regulatory stuff, all the many thousands of words and many dozens and dozens of articles that have been written, it's clear that in the wake of all this disaster, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. And that's what I think in terms of what your overall point about RTOs is, just that nobody ultimately is responsible. Where in the old regulated model, that CEO of that utility was going to be in the dock, and they're going to say, well, why didn't you and your company, because they were responsible and accountable to the PUC. Now in Texas, all the PUC commissioners have quit. There's no one left to blame. They've fired the CEO of ERCOT. He's gone, and all the generators are pointing at each other. No, it's their fault. It's not our fault. No, it's their fault. This is the gas guy's fault. No, it's the wind guy's fault. Well, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. That is a bad situation.
The buck does not stop anywhere. And if you're following some of the other writing about it right now, what's really happening is that it's full employment for lawyers' time. I mean, everybody's suing each other. I mean, it's kind of, I don't make as big a point on this in the book that I should, but I talk about the fact that there's a physical grid and there's a policy grid. And the physical grid, you want electricity to flow. And that means, for example, having gas available if it's a gas-fired power plant, or having an alternative fuel available if you know that gas is less likely to be. That's the physical grid. The policy grid is underwriting wind turbines so that they'll make money despite everything because you think wind turbines are great. That's the policy grid. There's this whole idea that the policy grid is all you need to fix. You get the lawyers, you sue people, and then it'll be fixed. No, you still need the fuel at the power plants. And that isn't, when I see what's going on, when I see the different lawsuits that are going on, I mean, there are several articles, there's yours, there's some by Llewellyn King about the different lawsuits that are going on. And they are multitudinous and they are at various levels of the judicial system.
Sure.
But basically, they don't actually put fuel at a power plant. I mean,
and those lawsuits aren't going to fix the physical grid or the policy grid. That's
right. They're not going to fix either grid. And I'm really sorry to say that, but it is true. And when you think about it, when you go to if you were able to go to a meeting with an RTO, you would see such a big ecosystem of consultants and stakeholders, they call them, and lawyers and so forth, and
lobbyists.
And lobbyists, you're not going to actually find a lot of engineers running around, you know?
Well, and it's interesting you make that point. So let's go back to the nuclear part of this, because it's one of the issues that I've followed, and you fought for the preservation of Vermont Yankee, and along with the other supporters, lost. That plant was closed. We saw the foolish, idiotic, almost criminal closure of the Indian Point plant in Buchanan, New York at the end of April, which we did, as we did with the Texas blackouts, we did 5 episodes around the closure of the Indian Point nuclear plant and why it was so wrong. But now we're facing, in the wake of that closure in April, the closure of the Byron and Dresden plants in Illinois, which again are critical zero carbon baseload power plants. And Exelon has made it clear, well, we're going to close them because we're not getting that. They're not economic for us. We're not making money. And it's difficult to say, oh, let's give a subsidy to Exelon. But is it, in your view, or will those plants close just like Buchanan, or just like Indian Point, and just like Vermont Yankee? I mean, it seems like there's not very much love being given to nuclear plants at the state level or the federal level.
I'm sorry to say that I fear that they will close. And I grew up in Illinois. I told you about Chicago and apartment buildings, but basically, I don't have a lot of love for coal, and Illinois is coal, and one of the reasons it had so many nuclear plants is to substitute for the coal. I mean, it cleaner skies. Now nowadays, of course, I am older, and nowadays coal is much cleaner skies than it was when I was growing up there. So I don't mean to just beat on coal plants, but I'm afraid that's true, but you understand that it isn't a wind turbine can pay the grid to take its power. It can do what's called negative pricing. It can say, grid operator, I'm going to give you 2 cents per kilowatt hour if you'll take my power. It can pay the customer to take its power. Meanwhile, any plant, any business that has some hope of the customer paying them can't compete with someone who's going to pay the customer. I mean, if there were 2 grocery stores next to each other, and one of them says, come here, we give you $1 for everything you buy. You buy what you want, we'll give you $1 every time you purchase something. And you don't have to pay us, we just give you the $1. The other grocery store would go out of business, right?
Sure. And that's because of the distortion of the production tax credit and the
The
investment tax.
production tax credit and the renewable energy certificates and credits.
The
And
RECs.
I don't know if I don't have it in front of me, but there was a really good article that showed that Tesla's one of the reasons that Tesla's cars do well is they can sell the equivalent of renewable energy credits also.
Right, right. That the manufacturer is selling the EV credits to other manufacturers that are
That's
required by
right.
federal law. So it's as I put it, it's not, they're not in a lot of these renewable energy companies. They're not in the business of selling electricity. They're subsidy miners. They're mining the subsidies and getting the money from the subsidies, and that's what makes their business work. And
Yes,
that's the
absolutely true.
and that's the piece that I wrote and published in Real Clear Energy, that there were 66 billion, according to the solar and wind lobbies themselves. $66 billion was spent in Texas before the blackouts, in the years before the blackouts. Well, Bill Peacock just published a report. During that time period, they got $22 billion in tax incentives, stimulus penny, tax abatements, call it what it is. Those are subsidies. So one out of every $3 that they spend, they get from taxpayers in one way or another. That's a good deal if you can get it. But it's a complete distortion of the electricity markets and undermining reliability. That's how I see it.
Yeah, it's another one of these things that it's a zombie situation. The tax credits will never go away. They'll never get killed. I mean, in 2012 was one of the biggest years for putting up wind turbines. And the reason was that supposedly the production tax credit was going to end on December 31st, 2012. Well, guess what? It didn't. I mean, a whole bunch of wind turbines got built that year. I mean, people were like, oh, God, we got to get it in, got to get it in. But it wasn't, they didn't have to rush. The production tax credit is still alive and well and will be renewed because you've got to, you see, one of the things about the wind turbines and so forth, or people in favor of renewables, is that they kind of have the best of both worlds. They're going to get rich. They're the only group that has a guaranteed profitability on an RTO grid. They are guaranteed profitability because so much of their money comes from other things than actually selling electricity. They can make it even if the nuclear plant says, well, we're not profitable, or the combined cycle gas turbine says, well, it's not working for us. The renewables can. And they're covered in glory because, after all, they are the future. They are renewables. They're not these old-fashioned, whatever
fossil
plants
fuels,
and fossil fuel plants.
fossil. Oh yeah, well,
Yeah,
that's the old, and then this is the new, and we're going to go with the new and the modern, and therefore we need grid modernization. What do you think of that term?
oh, it's an excuse for many things. It's an excuse for putting in transmission lines to faraway power plants that are intermittent. I mean, of course, if you put in a new power plant, you often have to put in new transmission, but usually you would put in a new power plant and you expect it's mostly going to be making power. Now you got to put in a transmission line to a plant that is going to be available only 30% of the time when the wind blows. I mean, so yeah, grid modernization.
So what if let me ask it again. So what are the first things that come to mind when you hear that term, grid modernization?
Well, I hear two things. The first thing is that they're building transmission lines to power sources that aren't reliable. And the second thing I hear is basically a certain level of intrusion, the ability to suddenly enroll you in demand response, where they're going to turn your air conditioner off for a little while and so forth. There is one part of grid modernization that's good, though, and that is that the smart meters can tell the utility about an outage like a tree falling down and blacking out power to an area, where before the utility actually had to sit there and wait till people to call. And after the first person called, they still didn't know where it happened. So they had to wait for a couple other people to call. So they got a bead on where they had to send their guys. The smart meters and grid modernization is good about that. But it's expensive because of the building for intermittent power that's far away, and it's also can be intrusive.
Well, to follow on that, Meredith, because I think that that's an interesting point that you're making there, and it's one that, I mean, several years ago now, I live in Austin. I because of that, I'm a captive customer of Austin Energy, which, is fine with me. I mean, they made money during the February blackouts. One of the few entities that made money, one of the few electric providers that made money. Some of the big gas transmission companies, Kinder Morgan, Energy Transfer, made a lot of money, right, for selling gas. But a few years ago, Austin Energy sent me a notice saying, well, we'd like to be able to shut off we want to be able to have your smart meter in your home, and we want to be able to shut off your air conditioner when demand is high. And I'm waiting, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, and the benefit for me is what, right? I'm going to give you the ability to control a critical appliance. I work at home, and you're going to be able to shut it off when you want to. What's in it for me? And there was nothing. It was like, well, why would I do that? Why would I give away the power to control my electricity use to someone else that I can't control? It didn't make any sense to me. But it seems to me this intrusiveness that you're talking about, it goes further and further the farther you go on the decarbonization route, including bans on the use of natural gas in your home, which we've talked about as well. And you made a really interesting point about the value of why that idea is one that doesn't make sense from a human level, because you said that we humans really like radiant heat. We like that ability to stand close to the fire. And yet these ideas about electrifying everything would take that choice of having combustion in the home away.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely true. And our skins are quite sensitive to feeling warm when we have radiance on it. I mean, it feels warmer. I mean, even if the outside temperature is the same, if you have warmth on your skin from radiance, you feel warmer. That's just, we can suck that radiance up and feel warmer. And I get kind of concerned with the idea that we're not actually human creatures. I mean, the idea is that we don't need to feel warm. We can give that up. We don't need to have just comfortable lives. I mean, because there's a greater good if we don't have a comfortable life. Now, those things actually worked. I mean, during World War II, there was rationing and it wasn't comfortable, but people knew what they were doing it for. But the thing is, if you are not allowed to have warmth in your house, what are you doing it for? People say, well, you're doing it to save the planet. Well, maybe, but, is it really going to save the planet for you to have a colder house or not to have a warm source of heat? I mean, do you have the kind of heating by heat pump? Are you heated by a heat pump?
No, but I've lived in a home that had a heat pump for briefly, and you and I talked about that, and it was noisy. One, because you had to run this outside compressor the whole time, and I didn't like it. I would turn the heat pump off and use the dish heaters, the resistance heaters, because I just didn't like to your point, I didn't feel warm. And in my home here in Austin, we use a gas-fired furnace, which is air blown. So during the blackout, we ran the fireplace nearly full time, all the time, and used that combustion, right, with radiant heat from the fireplace heated up the living room. And we had the gas stove, and so we kept the gas stove on and heated water, and that made the kitchen tolerable. And so, but no, and that's the solution, right? That we're going to electrify everything. Everybody's going to have a heat pump. It's going to be great. Well, I've lived with heat pumps. They're terrible.
Well, they the thing about a heat pump, from a thermodynamic point of view, is that the bigger the gap between the input and the output, the less efficient the heat pump is. So if you have a heat pump and it's 40 degrees outside and you want to bring your house temperature up to 70, that's fairly efficient. If it's 20 degrees outside and you want to bring it up to 70, then it's less efficient because just of the basic thermodynamics, you're going to need more electrical energy to bring it up there. So what heat pumps tend to do in terms of heating a house is they don't want to have that big a gap. So in other words, when they're putting air into the house, that air is not at over 100 degrees, which is what the air is when it's coming from your furnace. It's at a lower temperature. And depending on how you feel, and as I say, I'm an older woman, that can feel just plain drafty. I'm sorry, it can just feel drafty. Because the air is below your skin temperature and it's moving over you.
And yet this is the kind of mandate and the kind of reduction in consumer choice, and that's what it is, that the climate activists are pushing. And one of the interesting things, okay, so there was a lot of legislation, several bills passed during the legislative session that ended here in Texas on May 31st. Some of the bills, including SB3, were aimed at dealing with the blackout. And so there were some measures regarding weatherization that passed and, requirements for better coordination among the Railroad Commission and so on. But they also passed, I believe it was HB7, that bans natural gas bans. So there seems to me in the U.S., among all the many polarization issues, it's this ability of, in some states, they're saying, oh, well, you go ahead and ban natural gas. That's what's happening in California. The big push is on in Massachusetts. The city of Seattle has banned natural gas in new buildings, where states like Texas are saying, no, you can't do that. These cities are not allowed to do it. But I think it's ultimately... It's a human freedom liberty question, in my view, about the fuels that you're going to be allowed to use, and that it goes back to your intrusion point. And I mean, is that ring true to you? Am I making?
Yeah, and I mean, maybe somebody has a heat pump and they're very comfortable with it, so maybe I shouldn't even talk about it. I've been around them and I've studied them, but I mean, I haven't actually. Anyway, yes, it is intrusive, and I found. I was writing a letter to the editor recently because there was this whole thing about how a neighboring town wanted to have utility usage on a database so that there could be, in other words, my utility usage would go into a database so that people could target me for advanced utility, advanced energy savings things. And I'm like, no, I don't want you to share my utility usage with the third party, because, if you understand that if the police wanted to know what electricity I was using, they would have to subpoena or do a search warrant to find that out. And the idea that because we have ideas for these people who will help you save energy, we're going to put everybody's utility usage into a database. I'm like, well, tell me, is it going to be identified as me? You write down in the article that it's going to be targeted, third-party targeted offers. This sounds like they're going to be targeting me. They're going to know about me. And oh, we didn't say that. I said, well, what did you say? I mean, it's really... it's one of these things where you just don't know exactly what the plans are, but there's good reason to be suspicious that the plans are going to be a lack of privacy. That smart
a lack of privacy and a lack of consumer choice, that you're going to be required to have an induction stovetop, et cetera, and a heat pump and so on. Meredith, we're approaching an hour, and I know you have a hard stop because you have other obligations today, but a reminder to everyone who's listening, I'm talking to Meredith Angwin, who I'm proud to call my friend. She's the author of Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid, which came out in October of 2020 and has really, as you said earlier, Meredith, changed your profile and given you as an independent analyst, not affiliated with any fancy, blah, blah, academic institution, et cetera. How do you view, just a couple of last questions. As I looked at this, the debate now and the discussion around renewables and the discussion around decarbonization, study after study after study has been produced by academics from elite universities, Princeton, Cal Berkeley, Stanford, et cetera, saying, oh yeah, we can do all this. And this is, our model says we can do this. How do you feel about these models?
I get very frustrated with the fact that they don't have a path to doing it. They don't have an estimate of money. They don't have a way that they're going to convince people to spend this money. It's all very much thought experiments. Well, if we were able to build all of this, then we could do this. Well, yeah, but do you think you're going to be able to build all of this? So, for example, we're going to use green hydrogen instead of methane. And exactly how much is this green hydrogen going to cost compared to methane? And how many people do you think are going to use it? And the answer is, the answer is basically, we'll make them use it. And that really is distressing to me, because it's another way of enforcing energy poverty, in my opinion. And
I like the way
by the way,
another way of enforcing energy poverty, but the other part of it to me that's so missing is anything relating to the actual physical world.
Right.
If only we could build all these wind projects in Missouri and Nebraska and so on. Well, what about the backlash in those towns? Where are you going to have? Oh, you're going to build double, triple our high voltage transmission. Well, any consideration of how hard it is to build it? And that's, to me, the academic divorce from what is happening in the real world is really alarming, I think.
It is alarming. It is distressing, and it's distressing. It doesn't distress me too much if it comes from some policy wonks, but it bothers me when it comes from engineering schools, because it makes me wonder whether they are actually teaching engineering.
Because you're a
by the
chemist,
way,
you're a chemist by training, right?
Yes, I'm a chemist. I wanted to also say that although I have been, somewhat changed by the book, the Shorting the Grid book. I mean, I have been working in the utility industry most of my life. I have patents on control of nitrogen oxides. I have patents on control of thermal runaway from underground electrical systems. I worked a lot on corrosion control in nuclear plants. So I've been around a lot of the electric industry, and I just wanted to say that, because otherwise it seems like, how did she decide to write a book about utilities? Well, because I've been around them so much.
Well, I'm glad you added that. That this isn't coming out of left field for you, that this is where you've lived for decades. Well, so just the last couple of things then, Meredith. So I know we talked about how the book has changed the trajectory, and you're getting, I hate to use that line, your day in the sun, but I think it's more than a day. It's several days in the sun, and good for you. So who are you reading now? What places are you looking to? I thought there was a very good piece by a guy named Michael McKenna in Utility Dive the other day, critiquing this letter from the FERC commissioners about the need for more RTOs. Who do you read now when you want information about what's really going on? Whose work do you admire in that regard?
Well, yours, Llewellyn King, McKenna, Sonal Patel at Utility Dive, and I listen to podcasts, yours and Chris Kiefer's, and Alex Epstein has had some really good ones. I mean, and I enjoy reading that.
And Llewellyn King is a columnist at Forbes.
Yes, yeah. yes. And I don't think of him as a columnist at Forbes, so he is. I think of him as the founder of Energy Daily, which I read every day when I was at EPRI.
Okay.
So I think of him as someone who's been in the utility industry even longer than I have in keeping up with these things.
Right. Yeah, he is a veteran, and that's one of the things that I like about doing this podcast is I can I'm not really interested in having young people on. And I mean, I've had young people, and I've overstate that. I like having people that are veterans who have a lot of experience, because that to me is what's needed now, is a lot of people who have a lot of experience who can say, well, this is really how the system is working or not working. Last question, Meredith, what gives you hope now? I mean, you're now, well, we're 8 months since the release of your book. It's changed the trajectory of your career now. What gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is actually that people are beginning to pay attention. At least I think so. I think people are beginning to pay attention to the grid, as opposed to the constant, like, we love solar, we hate solar. We love nuclear, we hate nuclear. I mean, it's a unified, at the bottom line, it has to work as a unified system. And I have to say that when I was invited recently to talk to 2 chapters of the Sierra Club about my book, I said, okay, people are beginning to see this as a unified system. I mean, I'd like to be invited to more chapters of the Sierra Club, because my book is really about the grid is a unified system, and we better acknowledge that. And we better govern it so that it's reliable.
That's a good place to stop. A really
well,
good
thank
place.
you for
I
inviting
like
me.
That.
And everybody go by Shorting the Grid.
Well, we'll stop there. Meredith, thanks again for being on the 3rd time on the Power Hungry podcast. As I mentioned earlier, the podcast we did in February was the most popular podcast we've done out of 57. This is our 58th episode, the 1-year anniversary of the Power Hungry podcast. Thanks to all of you people in podcast land for tuning in. It's been a great deal of fun for me to be able to talk to people like Meredith and so many others that I've talked to over the last year. And we're going to keep going on this podcast. As 1 year is just getting started, and I've had a great deal of fun. So we'll end it there. Thanks again to Meredith Angwin. Buy her book, Shorting the Grid. It's on Amazon. It's on all fine booksellers. And I will sign off saying thanks to all of you again, marking the 1-year anniversary of the Power Hungry podcast. I'll see you for the next episode. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.